May 8, 1945. The war in Europe had officially ended that morning. Germany had surrendered. London was already preparing for celebration. Inside Whitehall, the mood was different. In a closed room, Winston Churchill met with the British chiefs of staff. No reporters. No ceremony. No language of victory. The war with Hitler was ending, but Churchill was not discussing Germany. He issued a direct order. The planners were instructed to prepare an operational plan for a military attack on the Soviet Union. Not a study, not a contingency, a concrete offensive plan. The target date for the opening of hostilities was set for July 1, 1945. The directive was explicit in its intent. The objective was to impose the will of the Western Allies on the Soviet Union by force of arms. The Red Army, which had just finished destroying Nazi Germany, was to become the next enemy. The operation was given a name chosen for its candor rather than its disguise. Operation Unthinkable. Churchill was present. He approved the order personally. This was not delegated initiative from the military. It came from the Prime Minister himself. No reference was made to Soviet aggression against Britain. No claim of imminent attack. The order was not framed as defense. It was framed as necessity. The War Cabinet was not consulted. Parliament was not informed. The British public, gathering in the streets below, had no knowledge that their government was quietly planning a new war while celebrating the end of the last one. Within hours, Churchill would step onto the Whitehall balcony and raise 2 fingers in the V sign. Cameras would capture a victorious leader marking the end of 6 years of war. Behind that image sat a signed instruction initiating preparations for another. The decision was made before the cheering began. At that moment, a narrow window still existed in which military action against the Soviet Union could be conceived without immediately collapsing into fantasy. The Western Allies occupied a continuous front from the North Sea to southern Germany. Their armies were intact, supplied, and battle-hardened. Air superiority over Western Europe was absolute. Strategic bombing had dismantled German industry and transport networks, leaving the continent's infrastructure dependent on Allied control. Ports, rail hubs, and fuel depots were already in Western hands. The Red Army, by contrast, was deep inside Central Europe. Its forces were massive, but they were extended. Soviet formations had advanced hundreds of miles from their logistical bases. Rail lines had been converted to Russian gauge behind them, but the system remained strained. Much of the Red Army's combat power was concentrated forward, focused on occupation and consolidation rather than maneuver against a new enemy. From a purely operational standpoint, the planners could identify a theoretical opening. A Western offensive launched immediately would strike Soviet forces before they could fully reorganize from wartime assault formations into occupation and defense postures. The Red Army had just concluded the most intense urban battle of the war in Berlin. Its units were exhausted. Casualty replacement systems were already overstretched. Ammunition expenditure during the final offensives had been immense. Western air power represented the single greatest asymmetry. The Soviets possessed large numbers of aircraft, but lacked the long-range bomber fleets, radar networks, and logistical depth that Britain and the United States commanded. Any initial phase of combat would be dominated by Allied control of the air. Soviet supply columns, bridges, and rail junctions would be vulnerable immediately. There was also a geographic consideration. The front lines in Germany and Poland were fluid and poorly demarcated. Boundaries between occupation zones were political agreements, not hardened defensive lines. Soviet units often sat intermingled with Allied forces at short distances. In theory, surprise could be achieved not by deception, but by speed. The planners understood that only a decisive initial blow could offer any chance of success. The concept relied on shock, rapid concentration, immediate penetration toward key nodes in Poland and Eastern Germany. The intent was not territorial conquest, but psychological and operational disruption, to force Moscow into negotiation before the full weight of Soviet manpower could be brought to bear. Time was the critical variable. Every week that passed favored the Soviet Union. Demobilization in the West was already beginning. American divisions were scheduled for redeployment to the Pacific. Public pressure to bring soldiers home was intense. Conversely, Soviet forces were not preparing to stand down. Their presence in Eastern Europe was expanding, not contracting. In military terms, July 1945 represented the last conceivable moment when the balance, while unfavorable, was not yet hopeless. The opportunity was never defined by advantage. It was defined by urgency. The planners knew that once the Red Army consolidated its positions, fortified its lines, and absorbed replacements, no Western force could dislodge it from the continent by conventional means. Any delay transformed risk into certainty. This was the logic that underpinned the planning effort. Not optimism, not confidence. A shrinking window in which action, however dangerous, remained theoretically possible. Churchill did not issue the order blindly. Before the planners ever began calculating divisions and supply ratios, he had already formed his assessment of the Soviet problem, and it was not emotional or impulsive. It was rooted in pattern recognition built over decades of observing authoritarian power. In his view, the alliance with Moscow had always been transactional and temporary. The Red Army's role in defeating Germany did not alter its underlying nature. It merely removed the constraint that had kept Soviet ambition aligned with Western survival. Churchill's warning began with Poland. Britain had entered the war in 1939 over Polish sovereignty. By May 1945, Poland existed in name only. Soviet security services controlled its government. Non-communist leaders were arrested, exiled, or eliminated. The promise of free elections remained on paper and nowhere else. Churchill had seen this outcome before the documents were signed. At Yalta, he watched concessions accumulate in one direction. Borders shifted. Governments were deferred to Soviet transitional authority. Each delay created facts on the ground that could not be reversed without force. Churchill understood that occupation was policy. His internal assessment was blunt. The Red Army would not withdraw voluntarily from territory it had bled to occupy. Its leadership interpreted security as dominance. Buffer states would become satellite regimes. Agreements would be honored only when enforcement was impossible. This was not speculation. It was inference drawn from behavior already visible. Churchill also understood timing. The death of Roosevelt removed a critical variable. The new American president was untested, unfamiliar with Stalin, and not bound by years of personal rapport. For a brief moment, Western alignment was fluid again. That moment would close quickly as domestic pressures in the United States demanded demobilization. Churchill's warning to his planners was implicit rather than rhetorical. He did not ask whether the Soviets intended confrontation. He assumed it. The only uncertainty, in his mind, was whether it would occur under conditions chosen by the West or imposed by Moscow. He believed delay carried its own cost. Every Soviet division that settled into Eastern Europe strengthened a political reality that would soon become irreversible. Every week that passed normalized occupation. Once borders hardened and regimes consolidated, the price of reversal would exceed any conceivable Western tolerance. The planners were therefore instructed not merely to calculate force ratios, but to consider momentum. Churchill wanted an answer to a specific question: whether decisive pressure, applied immediately, could alter Soviet behavior before the strategic balance locked permanently against the West. He did not demand optimistic conclusions. He demanded clarity. Churchill's credibility with his military chiefs rested on precedent. He had been wrong before, but he had also been alone in being right when consensus failed. He had opposed appeasement when it was fashionable. He had warned of German rearmament when it was inconvenient. Those memories carried weight in May 1945. Yet even he understood the fragility of his position. His authority derived from wartime leadership, not peacetime mandate. Elections loomed. Public exhaustion was total. There was no appetite for further sacrifice. This was why the warning remained confined to planning rooms. Churchill was preparing a case he might never be allowed to present. He sought not approval, but proof. Proof that the danger he perceived was either manageable through action or insurmountable by any means. The planners were not asked to agree with him. They were asked to test his fear against reality. What they would produce was not a rebuke of his logic, but a confirmation of its consequences. The overrule did not arrive as a dramatic rejection. It emerged through process, procedure, and arithmetic. Once the British Joint Planning Staff began formal analysis, the political nature of Churchill's order became unavoidable. The planners were not free to design an ideal campaign. They were constrained by alliances, domestic exhaustion, and commitments already made. The first constraint was American participation. Any offensive against the Soviet Union was meaningless without the United States. Britain alone lacked the manpower, industrial base, and logistical depth to sustain a continental war. Yet Churchill did not command American forces. He could not compel Washington to fight. He could only hope to persuade. That hope was thin. American policy in mid-1945 was oriented toward disengagement from Europe, not escalation. Millions of soldiers expected to go home. Public opinion viewed the Soviet Union not as a future enemy, but as a victorious ally. The political leadership in Washington had made no provision, legal, moral, or rhetorical, for a new war in Europe. This meant any plan had to assume American hesitation at best, refusal at worst. The planners also faced coalition realities. The Western alliance was fragile even at the moment of victory. French forces were rebuilding. Canadian forces were demobilizing. Smaller Allied contingents had neither the capacity nor the political mandate to participate in another war. Every additional participant required consent. None had been consulted. Then there was the British domestic situation. Britain was exhausted financially and socially. The economy was near collapse. Rationing continued. Cities were damaged. The electorate was weeks away from a general election that would end wartime unity. Any plan requiring sustained casualties was politically indefensible. The military chiefs understood this immediately. They were not judging feasibility in abstract terms. They were judging sustainability under democratic pressure. Against these constraints, the planners examined the battlefield reality. Their findings were stark. The Red Army outnumbered Western forces in Europe by a decisive margin. Not marginally, overwhelmingly. Soviet divisions were more numerous, more experienced in large-scale ground combat, and structured for attritional warfare. They possessed numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and infantry that could not be offset by Western air power alone. Even a successful initial blow would not be decisive. Soviet doctrine assumed absorbing punishment, then counterattacking with mass. The planners concluded that the Red Army would trade space for time, then unleash a counteroffensive that Western forces could not contain. This led to the core institutional objection. The British chiefs of staff were not opposed to risk. They had accepted risk throughout the war. What they rejected was strategic asymmetry. In their assessment, the Soviet Union could afford losses that Britain and the United States could not politically survive. Casualty tolerance was the silent variable shaping every conclusion. There was also fear of escalation beyond Europe. The Soviet Union bordered British interests in the Middle East and Asia. A continental war risked igniting secondary fronts Britain could not defend. Imperial commitments stretched thin already would collapse under sustained pressure. Churchill's proposal to rearm German soldiers was examined in this context. It solved one problem while creating several others. Using German troops could, in theory, mitigate manpower shortages. But it introduced catastrophic political consequences. Public opinion in Britain, America, and occupied Europe would recoil at the idea of former Nazi soldiers fighting alongside Allied forces weeks after surrender. The moral cost would be immediate. The cohesion of the alliance would fracture. The planners did not need to argue this explicitly. The implication was obvious. Institutionally, the chiefs of staff were also protecting the army from political exposure. If the plan failed, responsibility would not rest with Churchill alone. It would rest with the military leadership that had enabled it. They were not prepared to mortgage the institution's credibility on a war they believed could not be won. The overrule, therefore, took a bureaucratic form. The planners completed the offensive study as ordered, then quietly reframed the requirement. They produced a second version of Operation Unthinkable, defensive in nature. Its purpose was no longer to coerce the Soviet Union, but to survive a Soviet attack on Western Europe. This was the decisive shift. Without confronting Churchill directly, the chiefs of staff redirected the plan away from his intent. They did not refuse. They complied, then neutralized the threat by redefining the mission. The language of the final assessment was deliberately restrained. It did not accuse. It did not argue ideology. It used a single word to describe the offensive option: hazardous. In military reporting, this was not cautionary phrasing. It was a warning. Churchill did not dispute the analysis. He did not demand revision. He did not escalate the argument to Washington or Parliament. He accepted the judgment in silence. The system had done what systems do. It absorbed a dangerous idea, processed it through institutional constraints, and rendered it inert without open confrontation. Within weeks, Churchill himself would be removed from office by election results. The question of whether he could have forced the issue became irrelevant. Operation Unthinkable did not fail because it was immoral, or provocative, or unprecedented. It failed because every institution required to execute it had more to lose than to gain. The consequences unfolded without a declaration, without a shot fired, and without any formal acknowledgement that a decision had ever been made. The Red Army remained where it was. In Poland, Soviet-backed authorities consolidated control. Non-communist political figures disappeared into prisons or exile. Elections were delayed, reshaped, then rendered meaningless. What had been described as temporary administration became permanent structure. British protests arrived as memoranda. They produced no effect. Across Eastern Europe, the same pattern repeated. Ministries were staffed by Moscow-aligned officials. Security services answered to Soviet advisors. Land reform and industrial nationalization dismantled pre-war political elites. Each action was incremental, legally framed, and irreversible once completed. There was no single moment of collapse. There was a sequence of closures. Western forces withdrew to agreed occupation zones. Demobilization accelerated. American divisions departed in large numbers. British units thinned. The physical distance between Allied and Soviet forces widened not through retreat, but through absence. Power vacuums were filled methodically. The strategic balance Churchill had feared did not shift suddenly. It hardened. By late 1945, the possibility of coercing Soviet behavior through military pressure no longer existed. The Red Army was entrenched from the Baltic to the Balkans. Defensive lines were formalized. Logistics were stabilized. Command structures adapted from wartime assault to occupation control. What had once been a forward-deployed army became a garrison empire. The Western response was diplomatic because no other response remained viable. Protests were issued. Agreements were referenced. Appeals were made to wartime promises. Each appeal acknowledged, implicitly, that enforcement was no longer possible. This was the direct consequence of the decision not to act. In military terms, the window identified by the planners closed exactly as predicted. Soviet numerical superiority translated into strategic immunity. Any attempt to reverse the situation now would require levels of mobilization and casualty tolerance inconceivable to Western democracies. The cost was not paid immediately. That is why it was politically survivable. Instead, the cost was deferred and distributed. Germany became divided not as a negotiated settlement, but as a necessity of containment. Economic recovery in the West required integration under American protection. Eastern Germany became a forward outpost of Soviet power. The line through Berlin was not an accident. It was the physical manifestation of a decision already taken in May. Military planning shifted accordingly. British and American strategists abandoned offensive concepts in Europe. New doctrines emphasized deterrence, defense, and delay. The assumption underlying all future planning was that Eastern Europe was lost and unrecoverable by conventional means. This assumption hardened into policy. Alliances formed not to liberate territory, but to prevent further loss. Rearmament occurred under a different logic. Forces were stationed not to advance, but to signal consequence. The objective was no longer victory. It was stability. For Britain, the implications were severe. Imperial overstretch collided with continental irrelevance. Resources diverted to European defense reduced capacity elsewhere. Influence declined as American power filled the vacuum. Britain remained formally central, but operationally dependent. Churchill himself watched these outcomes from the opposition benches. He did not publicly reference Operation Unthinkable. He did not cite the planning studies. He did not claim vindication. His warnings reappeared only indirectly, in speeches that described an emerging division across Europe without naming its cause. By the time he spoke of an Iron Curtain, it was already in place. The chiefs of staff who had labeled the plan hazardous were not contradicted by events. Their forecasts of Soviet reaction proved accurate. Any direct confrontation would have escalated rapidly and likely disastrously. The Red Army did not require provocation to consolidate. It required only time. What their analysis did not capture was the permanence of the outcome. Once Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, it did not drift back through diplomacy or pressure. It required generational change, economic exhaustion, and internal collapse decades later. None of that was visible in 1945. What was visible was the immediate alignment of power. The decision not to act ensured peace in the short term. It also ensured division in the long term. From 1945 onward, every major Western strategic commitment was shaped by that reality. Defense spending, alliance structures, nuclear deterrence, proxy conflicts, all were downstream effects of a continent that could no longer be contested conventionally. Operation Unthinkable was never executed. Its absence did not preserve unity. It formalized separation. The battlefield consequences Churchill had sought to avoid occurred without battle. Europe was partitioned by agreements enforced only on one side. The line held not because it was fair, but because it could not be moved. In that sense, the consequence of the original decision was not war. It was acceptance. By 1998, the record of Operation Unthinkable was no longer secret. The British government declassified the planning documents, revealing in stark detail what had been considered and why it never progressed. The declassified files confirmed that the original plan called for a Western offensive against the Soviet Union, with a target date of July 1, 1945. The planners had produced detailed estimates of troop strength, supply requirements, and the operational feasibility of such an attack. Their conclusion remained consistent with the assessments made in May 1945. A conventional attack would have been hazardous, bordering on suicidal, given the overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority of the Red Army in Europe. Churchill had considered rearming 100,000 surrendered German soldiers to mitigate the imbalance, a proposal that horrified both British military leaders and political advisors. Memoirs of key figures, including military chiefs and subordinate planners, corroborated the internal dynamics. They described Churchill as acutely aware of the political limits of his authority, attempting to navigate between foresight and feasibility. The files showed that his order was less a strategic necessity than a reflection of his understanding of Soviet intentions, that Eastern Europe would soon fall under Moscow's control unless force intervened. Yet no government in Britain, nor in the United States, would countenance the immediate execution of such a plan. Further evidence emerged in analyses of post-war military strategy. NATO planning, the Berlin blockade, and the early Cold War deployments traced their logic to the understanding that Eastern Europe could not be reclaimed by conventional force once Soviet occupation was consolidated. Historians have noted that the planners' warning in May 1945 anticipated the Cold War's geopolitical realities with uncanny accuracy. The hazardous assessment became a post-war touchstone, cited repeatedly in studies of preventive war and alliance management. Subsequent scholarly research emphasized the interplay of political and military constraints. Churchill's fear of Stalin was validated, not because the attack would have succeeded, but because the Red Army did indeed occupy the regions he sought to protect. Eastern Europe remained under Soviet influence for decades. The Cold War that followed was in essence a continuation of the territorial and ideological imbalance that Operation Unthinkable had sought to forestall. The post-war record, therefore, situates the plan as both a cautionary tale and a confirmation of Churchill's geopolitical instincts, an accurate prediction rendered unachievable by democratic, coalition, and logistical realities. In sum, the archival record and retrospective accounts converge. Operation Unthinkable was real, seriously planned, and technically considered. It was blocked not by uncertainty about Soviet intentions, but by practical constraints, and its impossibility was confirmed by hindsight, leaving only the historical shadow of what might have been. Operation Unthinkable is a closed historical case. Churchill made the decision. He signed the order. He tasked his chiefs of staff with planning an offensive against the Soviet Union. The directive was explicit, July 1, 1945, as the target date. Military analysis proved the plan impossible. The Red Army outnumbered Western forces. Tanks, artillery, infantry, all favored Moscow. Even with 100,000 rearmed German troops, the probability of success was negligible. Planners labeled the proposal hazardous. No revision, no escalation could change that assessment. Political realities overruled. American forces were constrained by public opinion and redeployment priorities. Britain was exhausted financially and socially. Coalition partners were unavailable. The system itself, through institutional processes, neutralized the plan without confrontation. The immediate consequence, inaction. The Red Army consolidated control over Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Balkans fell under Soviet administration. Defensive lines were established. Western powers could not reverse them. Strategic opportunity closed. Long-term consequences, the Cold War. NATO, divided Europe, nuclear deterrence. All downstream effects of a continent whose eastern half could not be reclaimed conventionally. Churchill's fears were accurate, but the offensive he envisioned could not be executed. Operation Unthinkable never occurred. Its existence remained secret for decades. When declassified, it confirmed the tension between strategic foresight and practical limitations. The plan was real, the calculations rigorous, but the system, political, institutional, and logistical, made action impossible. The verdict is final. Churchill was right about Soviet intentions. He was wrong about what Britain and its allies could achieve. The plan was technically feasible only on paper and politically unworkable in reality. The consequences of inaction proved his prediction correct. History confirms both the fear and the impossibility.